Welcome to Coaching with Confidence and Care podcast, inspired by common topics that arise in coach training, mentoring, and supervision. I am Dr. Luba Desamidze, the founder of Upthink Coaching. I'm an active coach trainer, mentor, and supervisor. If you are listening, you're probably looking to deepen your skills as a coach. I hope this podcast will be a helpful resource for you and contributes to your journey. Welcome to the last episode of 2025 and the 20th episode of the podcast. I'm so glad to be finishing this year with a beautiful episode number, which also shows my commitment to this podcast and to sharing my thoughts on coaching to support coaches' development. Towards the end of the year, I started to think about whether I should plan any learning for myself, and if so, what kind of specific learning that might be. As I was reflecting on this, the topic of this podcast naturally emerged. I found myself wondering, should I be asking about new learning, or should I first be pondering what I want to unlearn in 2026? And do I want to reflect on what I have already unlearned this year? The topic of this podcast naturally emerged, and it's going to be about unlearning. I've heard so many times from coaching students who took part in our programs, it's not the learning that's difficult, and it's not learning that comes first. It is usually unlearning, because in order to change your patterns, in order to become an active listener, and in order to enhance your presence, you need to rewire all the previous habits that you've had. And that's pretty much what unlearning is about. I love the idea of unlearning because when we unlearn something, this creates space for something new. I also find the idea quite playful, and I'm a big supporter of playfulness in work because that leads to innovation, curiosity, and open-mindedness. You cannot take your clients where you haven't gone yourself. This is not about career, titles, or achievements. It's about the inner shift that allows all those changes to happen. And your own journey with unlearning can support your clients in unlearning outdated self-narratives. When I talk about unlearning, I do not mean erasure of old patterns. I certainly do not. I'm never a fan of this black and white approach or any kind of canceling or pushing something out. This may create resistance or avoidance, which may backfire. Besides, neuroscience shows that old neural pathways are rarely deleted. That could be one of the explanations why it's so easy to slide back into old patterns. Even when you are in the maintenance stage of change, old patterns do not get deleted. Instead, new pathways are created and they inhibit prior ones, which means that your default behaviors remain available, but they're no longer automatically deployed. You don't have that autopilot anymore, but it may resurface under stress until or unless new responses have consolidated. Why do I talk about unlearning in a coach's podcast? Most of the challenges, most of the questions that coaching students ask in training, mentoring, or supervision arise from lack of unlearning. They're rarely about not knowing what to do. They're about not yet letting go of familiar ways of thinking, relating, or positioning oneself in the session. Coaching students often try to add new skills on top of old habits, explaining, fixing, performing, or sometimes controlling, without loosening the patterns that made those habits necessary in the first place. Until those patterns are questioned and softened, learning remains intellectual and, somewhat unstable maybe, easily overridden under pressure. Unlearning in this sense is not a loss, but a maturation of practice. A gradual release of certainty, role-based identity, and over-reliance on technique in service of presence and genuine responsiveness to the client. Next reason is that commitment to continuous learning is part of the coaching mindset, and it is explicitly reflected in the ICF core coaching competencies, which were revised in 2025, by the way. The previous podcast episode is dedicated to those changes. So if you want a recap of the updates and their implications, I invite you to check it out. We work with people who are in the process of unlearning old unhelpful ways of thinking, responding, or behaving. How can we support unlearning if we do not actively champion it ourselves? I believe that as coaches, we need a commitment to keeping our mindsets flexible and adaptive, allowing us to remain open-minded and curious with our clients. So it would be inaccurate or maybe even too bold to assume that once you officially become a coach, you have unlearned everything that you needed to unlearn and that you've consolidated everything you needed to consolidate. When you work with people, and if you work in a way that implies continuous improvement, learning is never done, and neither is unlearning. Last but not least, I want to talk about unlearning because as mastery increases, a coach's work becomes less rule-based or less technique-based and more situationally responsive. That is, it emerges from the quality of their being and the quality of their presence. Even if you learn some models and techniques or step-by-step frameworks at the beginning of your coaching journey, it may be worth considering whether it is time to unlearn some of the strategies you rely on very often in favor of greater spontaneity, relational presence, curiosity, and comfort with not knowing. Then a question may be, do we have to specifically focus on unlearning? Does it not happen naturally at the same time as we learn new things? Well, when it comes to coaching or any other type of inner work, cognitive change alone is insufficient for effective unlearning. Think back to your first experience of coaching. When you watched a coaching demo, or when you watched someone else coach, or when you read a book on coaching, it all sounded so logical, didn't it? And most likely it looked effortless too, especially when you observed someone experienced. But then you had to do it yourself for the first time. Remember how challenging it felt? You know, when I had my first coaching session ever, I almost felt paralyzed. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what I was supposed to do or whether I was doing the right thing. Even though by the time I went into my first practice session, I knew very well what coaching was and how it worked, it still felt weird and unfamiliar. It was almost like playing a new sport. Before you develop muscle memory, it may feel very strange, right? So it's not enough to know how to do it. It's also important to give up some of the old habits that get in the way of coaching. Studies on behavior change consistently show that insight does not reliably alter behavior without emotional and experiential components. Clarity does not equal change, and you might have observed that with your own coaching clients. Understanding something does not mean being able to carry it through. If you just talk through this at the surface level, patterns will not loosen. For all patterns to loosen, they must be reactivated in a context of sufficient emotional safety. Unlearning is a vulnerable process. You cannot really avoid emotions if you want to make any difference. So what are some other things that make me so fond of unlearning as a coaching educator? I think that accepting the need to unlearn means that you agree to follow a non-linear pattern as a coach. A linear pattern would mean continuing the journey exactly from where you left off. Well, you don't deny where you came from and you don't give it up. But you do need to take a step back occasionally and revisit some things you once believed were true. Accepting non-linear development makes it easier for a coach to do more complex work, say organizational work, team coaching, systemic coaching, because non-linear development is the reality. Behavioral change research shows that regression or relapse is a normal phase of learning. or normal phase of change and not a failure. If you do not accept relapse or regression, as a coach, you may resist going backward, and then your clients may adopt the same pattern, which may not necessarily be helpful or useful. Acceptance that progress is not linear can really support work in complex circumstances. I also think that the value of unlearning is in developing humility, which is crucial for coaches. What you believed was true may turn out to be only partially true. Some best practices you've kept for years may only be partially effective. We work with not knowing. We shift the spotlight to our clients instead of ourselves. We accept that we never fully know what's going to be the result of what we are doing, and that we can never guarantee that a certain intervention or a question will be successful. Now, if you ask me what it might be helpful for coaches to unlearn, I'd say that one of those things would be excessive control. In coaching, excessive control interferes with being in the moment, developing responsiveness, and being okay with not knowing. This is the opposite of how it works in other contexts. For example, when you learn something, say in the workplace, you learn a new process and you have some experience with it, and then you are considered skilled and you could instruct and monitor others doing it, and there are certain steps you know how to follow in order to get optimal results. In coaching, this is only partially true. There are definitely some guidelines and best practices that help optimize the flow, but you never know what's going to happen because you're not really in charge of the results of the process. You accompany someone else's process and let it unfold. It's not your process. So being an expert without being an expert and being okay with it is definitely something to master. You need to let go of the need to know how the session is going to unfold and how to deal with everything that emerges in order to learn to be okay with not knowing. You need to trust the process, and it's more difficult than it seems. You may also need to unlearn the need to be helpful. I know this may sound a bit counterintuitive, but stay with me for a moment. We are being helpful, but we are not overly obsessed with the need to be helpful in a way or to an extent that makes us perform in a coaching session. I'd say being helpful is more like a general philosophy, approach, and state of mind. It's like an overarching idea that guides everything we do in a coaching session. The intention of our work is to be helpful, but trusting the process and not forcing behaviors, not forcing the client to accept your help in the way you might want to provide it. Well, again, I know this may sound counterintuitive, but it is not. Well, here comes another thing that is helpful to learn or partially unlearn. I think embracing the paradox is important for good coaching. You're helping without forcing help, or knowing better what helps looks like, or without performing. What I mean by performing in coaching is not being with a client, but being for an imagined audience. Whether that audience is an assessor, a client, a sponsor, a mentor, an internal standard, or your own inner critic. It shows up when the coach prioritizes saying the right thing, asking the right question, or demonstrating competence or demonstrating their own experience rather than staying attuned to what's actually emerging in the moment. Performing often sounds polished and technically correct, yet it distances the coach from presence, responsiveness, and genuine contact. From a supervisory perspective, performance is usually a protective strategy. It emerges from anxiety, insecurity, or an over-identification with your role. Unlearning performance, therefore, is not about becoming less skilled, but about trusting your capacity to be impacted, to not know, and to let the coaching unfold without needing to prove anything. Studies on therapeutic alliance shows that outcomes improve when practitioners prioritize presence, attunement, relationship, contact over technique delivery. There's a very famous book by Marsha Reynolds called Coach the person, not the problem. And that's very much in line with that idea. Focus on the person, be present with the person, and the quality of your presence will let the dialogue unfold. Do not design the path for your clients. Don't necessarily think that there is a magic technique or a magic question or a way of doing things with clients that can guarantee results. The way of being is always much more powerful than the way of doing. And I think that's another thing that we all need to unlearn, because we are so conditioned to do or to perform in all the other contexts that we are in. At school, at university, and at work, so much doing is expected of us, and not enough attention is spent on developing being. What do I see coaches unlearn, which makes me excited as a coaching educator? I've seen many coaches unlearn the use of familiar techniques they relied on as crutches when they were just starting out, and instead learn to step into not knowing. I've seen coaches unlearn being extremely self-cautious while the client is speaking and letting their inner dialogue overpower presence. I've seen coaches unlearn rushing to clarity, summarize, assume, or skip emotional work in order to prioritize the action steps. It's always beautiful to see when coaches unlearn monitoring their performance moment by moment, because such a hyper-cautious approach creates a lot of tension in the session. I've also seen many coaches unlearn the fear of silence and unlearn the need to know the perfect question. This adds spontaneity, which often signifies a transition to a new level of mastery. So how can we keep becoming even more successful unlearners? I've been thinking about qualities that support an unlearning mindset, and first and foremost is tolerance for ambiguity. The capacity to hold uncertainty makes unlearning safer. We stick to old patterns because as biological beings, we are wired for safety. Our brains are wired for safety because safety means survival. What's familiar feels safe. What's new may feel risky. Cultivating tolerance for uncertainty, embracing it, and finding comfort in it can make unlearning lighter. Emotional intelligence plays a huge role. Being mindful of emotions as they arise. Unlearning is not just cognitive reframing, as I mentioned earlier, it needs emotional resonance. Avoidance blocks learning, and understanding which emotions trigger avoidance can be very helpful. Then it's self-reflection without excessive self-monitoring. Self-monitoring is important for helping professionals, especially in relational work, but being obsessed with it is not helpful. As you are holding that safe space for your clients to unlearn, think about yourself. Where do you unlearn your own patterns, if you do? And who's holding you? If you hold space for others, who is holding you? Supervision is one of the best ways to support unlearning. It allows for self-monitoring without relying solely on your own lens. A supportive, unbiased professional can hold the space and offer honest feedback, which often accelerates behavior change more effectively than self-correction. Open-mindedness and contextual sensitivity also support unlearning. It's not about canceling behaviors, especially those tied to identity, but it's about recognizing when patterns are less appropriate and which patterns are less appropriate. You don't label them wrong, but you put them in the waiting room. You choose mindfully which pattern serves you best and invite something new into the space that opens up. Remember that unlearning is not an endpoint. It's a transition stage. It reminds me of the theory U principle, let go to let come. Once the blank space appears, new behaviors can emerge. These new responses must be practiced across contexts to consolidate and align with a revised self-concept. Work continues at both the being level and the doing level. And when you start, remember that relapse may be part of the journey. It doesn't mean that you're failing. You are re-entering the cycle of change. I want to invite you to reflect on the past year, not from the point of view of what you have learned or what you are going to learn, but what you have unlearned. What have you unlearned this year? And what are you going to unlearn next year? Let me share some of the questions I've prepared to reflect on my own unlearning as we approach the start of the new year. What did I stop doing in sessions that actually made my coaching stronger? What part of my coaching identity shifted this year and how? When did I resist unlearning? And what was I protecting? What do I still overvalue in my coaching that may be ready to be unlearned? What would my coaching look like if I trusted unlearning even more? These are the thoughts I want to leave you with at the end of the year. Think about your unlearning moments this year and what you are ready to unlearn next. This is the last episode of 2025. In the next one, we'll start the new year with a very practical topic: how to define a clear, measurable session goal and meaningful measures of success, especially when the client brings something big, vague, or abstract. It's one of those skills that looks simple on paper and turns out to be much more subtle in practice. Just a reminder that new episodes come out every 2 weeks and alternate with our YouTube interview series, Conversations with Coaches, where I sit down with practitioners who practice different approaches or coach in different niches to talk openly about how they actually work. If you're interested in developing your coaching beyond tools and techniques into relational depth, reflective capacity, and psychologically informed work, our ICF-accredited programs open again in spring 2026. All the details are on the website if you want to explore it in your own time. www.upthinkcoaching.com. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always open to thoughtful professional conversations, and I work one-on-one through mentor coaching and supervision for coaches who want a more reflective space to think about their work. That's it for this year. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.